Characteristics of Romantic Era Music. In terms of chronology, the Romantic Era followed directly from the Classical Era. This was a period of significant political, economic and social change reflected in the music of the time. The Romantic Era was one of the most important and influential periods in the history of Western music. The composers of the time pushed the boundaries of what was possible, creating some of the most beautiful and emotionally powerful music ever written. We hope you enjoy exploring this wonderful period in musical history with us. A closer examination of the Romantic Era begins with the work of Ludwig van Beethoven, 1770 to 1827. His illustrious career spans two eras and lays a foundation for Romantic composers. Beethoven's music was a patron of classicism but always acknowledged the development of Romantic music. His symphonic form made an enormous stride into the Romantic era, particularly the Third Symphony, the Eroica. Mahler, 1860 to 1911, could never conceive of his Second Symphony, the Resurrection, without Beethoven's symphonic output. With the shift in artistic focus during the Romantic era, we find composers modifying and even breaking classical musical forms. Haydn's Last Symphony, 104th, was only 30 minutes long and divided into 4 movements. As we move further into the Romantic era, the symphonic form extends dramatically, not only in duration but also in terms of formal structure. We begin to find composers blending multiple movements into a single unified composition. The boundaries of movements begin to blur towards a unified piece relying on motivic and thematic development. When Romantic music is analyzed in detail, all pieces are impressive versions of classical music. The popularity of the tone poem explains how composition treads its way through the entire symphony. Liszt used similar techniques to construct many of his compositions. During his time, composers' increasing desire to create music that evokes raw emotions altered the nature of the ensemble. The orchestra during the Romantic era was one such ensemble that was modified beyond anything Mozart could identify with his piece. By the end of the Romantic era, orchestras housed more than 100 players, often with a chorus and organ. This development allowed composers to exploit dynamic ranges, which gave rise to breathtaking compositions. The main characteristics of Romantic era music are an increased emphasis on emotion and expression in the lyrics and the music. This was often in response to the Industrial Revolution and the social changes that were taking place at the time. A greater focus on imagination and fantasy, with composers often inspired by myths, legends, and nature. A move away from the formal and structured music of the Classical era towards a more free-flowing and improvisational style. A greater use of instrumental color and tone creates a wider range of emotions. An increase in the use of chromaticism, dissonance, and tonality. A larger orchestra, with more instruments added as the Romantic era progressed. This gave composers a greater palette of sound to work with. Chopin, Beethoven, and Liszt were as famous for their performances as their compositions. The rise of the virtuoso leads directly to the development of the concerto as a vehicle for Romantic expression. The soloist in the Romantic concertos was of paramount importance, as it dazzled and thrilled the audience. The Romantic era encompasses emerging composers from Russia, England, France, Denmark, Finland, and Hungary. This eventually led to an artistic slant toward nationalism in the later part of the 19th century. In line with the developments in instrumental music, opera as a musical form gathered significant momentum during the Romantic era. Opera, like the symphony orchestra, expanded in the Romantic era. It grew and became more lavish in both subject matter and setting. While the early operas were often short, one-act pieces, the genre expanded to include longer, multi-act works. This allowed for greater character development and plot complexity. Some of the finest operas were composed in the Romantic era because of universal themes. The magnificence of the work of Italian composers like Verdi or Puccini has provided us with endless songs. Richard Strauss and Wagner created operatic works that are beautifully complex. They further the musical language of opera, taking tonality to its breaking point. The eventual collapse of tonality was perhaps overlooked among all the great changes that the Romantic era brought. Chromaticism with unrelated keys led to the development of musical form. By the time Wagner had written Tristan and Isolde, the world stood on the brink of a complete revolution. The Romantic era in music was one of great change and development. It saw the virtuoso performers rise and the symphony orchestra's expansion. Opera as a musical form also gathered significant momentum during this time. The main characteristics of Romantic era music are an increased emphasis on emotion and expression, a greater focus on imagination and fantasy, and a move away from the formal and structured music of the Classical era. These changes led to some of the most beautiful and emotionally stirring music ever composed.